Now, what do I say? I think it's all been said. I do want to thank Aisling and Peter for the presentation, and Adam, which was a surprise. I was told there was no surprises, and then, so Adam did well. I was sort of wondering when my other son Wesley came up to the room, and in front of the bed there's a television. Then you turn it around, it's a mirror, and the mirror was facing the bed. And Wesley said, "What's going on here?" So all I can say to Mary is yes. Mind you, secret to a happy marriage, Mary tells me, and then I decide. So yes. Mr. Chairman and delegates, distinguished guests, at the end of a career spanning 46 years in mental health and ID services, it is appropriate I spend a little time looking back at where we've come from, consider the challenges currently facing us and our services, and maybe pose some questions for future consideration. In 1971, I commenced my training as a psychiatric nurse in St. Ian's Hospital, Portrane. Yes, the Academy by the Sea. I spent 9 really good years there. Portrane was a wonderful place in those days. Wonderful staff, brilliant friends, great patients. The patients were wonderful. There was a lot of kindness in the system. I probably became a nurse by accident. I had applied for many different jobs, and nursing came up first. And from my first day in Portrane, I loved the job. I really enjoyed the staff I worked with, the patients we cared for. I think I was radicalised as a P&A activist by the neglect that was visited upon St. Ian's by health service managers and politicians who so badly failed our nurses in their efforts to maximise care to those who so badly needed it. I do not look back fondly on growing up in the 60s and 70s. Life was austere. There were different standards applying, though something called sex had recently been discovered. That was probably the only light bit in it. But people's attitudes were often strangely uncaring. And I recall with Shawnee McGarry over there, and Harry Keegan and others, nursing young men with Down syndrome down in Seven East, whose mothers had rejected them at birth because they had Down syndrome. It was a sign of failure, maybe even a sign of sin. And the mothers couldn't cope with this. Those young people were brought into the hospital initially, into the children's unit, and reared as babies in the children's unit down by the sea. Reared, looking back now, by female nurses up to the age of 18, and then transferred to male adult units at 18, where there was no female staff, it was all male staff. And it must have been quite a challenge for those young men adapting. In those days, the Republic of Ireland incarcerated more people in our mental hospitals per 1,000 population than most other countries in the world. Among that population were people with serious mental ill health, those described as, that time as being mentally handicapped was called, those who were psychopathic, those who might generally be described as oddballs and misfits. I will just pause for a moment and tell you about one of the boys with Down syndrome. He lived there with us, and we nursed him, and there were 2 of them I worked in particular with, and they could have run the ward. In fact, sometimes Harry did run the ward. They were great lads. And I met him sometime later when they had moved out of Portrane into another service and then into the community. And that was great to see those people, but they should never have been in cities or anywhere else. We blame the Catholic Church for these things, we blame politicians. It's time that Irish society took responsibility for ourselves. Women and men made decisions to incarcerate babies, and they can't blame others. Those were decisions that were made, and society was part of that, and society didn't frown on that in any way. So we should all grow up and take responsibility. In 1966, the Commission In 1966, the Commission of Inquiry into Mental Illness boldly announced an era of considerable hope has arrived. Over 50 years later, we are still hoping. Today, we can claim credit as a society for closing down the mental hospitals. We must also take the blame for condemning large numbers of our mentally ill to long periods in prison or new mental hospitals. The hopes of 1966 were rekindled in 1984 with the publication of Planning for the Future, and perhaps even more so in 2006 with the publication of Vision for Change. However, many people of my era are cynical, frustrated and angry. The 20% of the health budget mental health services enjoyed in 1966 has now dwindled to around 6%. The recommendations of Vision for Change, so warmly welcomed by so many, have been pruned by health service managers to deliver cuts and savings rather than the vision we all envisaged. Community services which were to be put in place to facilitate the closure of beds have only partially been delivered, while the beds have been closed anyway. I am happy at the same time that the P&A played a significant role in closing down our mental hospitals, and I'm proud of the role of our members and the role they played in successfully rehabilitating large numbers of their patients so that they were able to enjoy better lives in the community. I moved to St. Denis in Carlow in 1980, and over the last 25 years since I left St. Denis to work with the P&A, it has been a great pleasure to meet the many former patients who've now been able to enjoy lives within a welcoming community. And as I'm speaking, I can see the faces popping up and the names and nicknames of the characters, some of whom, I know one man was rehabilitated after 45 years in St. Denis. Another man who'd beaten his father to within an inch of his life and was hospitalised, had been in hospital for over 20 years and his family wouldn't allow him home. We sent out a nurse to talk to his mother, his father was dead, talk to his mother and sister to explain how well he was and ask if he could come and visit. And she was terrified. And it took a couple of visits and reassurances and an agreement that we would stay with him on the first visit. And Sean went out and he stayed for an hour and had tea. He went back again and stayed for an afternoon. And after about 2 months, Sean went home, never came back to do this. That was probably, in terms of nursing, the most enjoyable part of my career, seeing the successes that we achieved. And what's frustrated me for all those years since, that I know the talents that every one of you have. I know the talents of our mental health and ID nurses, and I know how much we could achieve with the resources. And the frustration has been that every so often we have wonderful developments like the Kavanagh model, or we have little small developments which are top class, excellence in practice. And what we do in Ireland, we build a wall around it in case it might escape. where if that was private industry, it would be mainstreamed so that benefits would accrue to the wider industry, or in our case, population. But moving on, I have never truly believed that acute psychiatric units based in general hospitals is the ideal location in which to care for people who are acutely mentally ill. But that is policy, and I do accept that there are benefits that accrue to those who are treated there. It's interesting how some of our most respected private mental hospitals operate in old institutions. The problem with the public institutions was that they were neglected and allowed to deteriorate. Today, of course, when I go to some of those old hospitals, they're surprisingly well maintained, but they're now housing health service managers and administrative staff. Funny that. Over the last 20 years, I've listened to every Minister for Health speak about the need to enhance child and adolescent mental health services, CAMHS. Report after report has pointed to the need for and shortage of dedicated beds for CAMHS. With a rising population, we now need even more beds. Yet we haven't even reached the initial target of 100 beds. It is a fact that we now have some very good, very modern facilities in which to care for children with mental ill health. And I want to welcome the investment in those units. We just don't have enough of them. Every so often we read reports criticising the numbers of children and adolescents admitted to our adult psychiatric units and occasionally of those admitted to paediatric hospitals because of the shortage of accessible CAMHS beds. Plans are rolled out time and time again. And those plans, the Minister will say, are going to deliver more beds. However, even if we had the extra beds tomorrow, it is doubtful we will be able to use them, as we do not have enough nurses. I'm delighted to note government's renewed commitment to 24/7 community mental health services. This union took industrial action last summer in pursuit of a number of issues, one of which was to force the HSE to commit to the provision of 4 pilot sites for 24/7 services in different parts of the country. And as Peter told us yesterday, 25 years ago in Sydney, he was working in such a service, and 25 years later, we don't have one that's comparable. So agreement was reached, and we eventually succeeded in getting a committee in place to oversee implementation of the project. Progress, as you've been told over the last couple of days, has been painfully slow. There is no evidence that the HSE share our enthusiasm or that of government for the delivery of 24/7 services. Indeed, colleagues, you may have to consider taking further action to force the HSE to implement government policy. Indeed, I think government, if it is serious about the implementation of 24/7 services and other outstanding agenda items envisioned under Vision for Change, should really appoint a mental health czar. I've spoken of this concept a few years ago, a mental health operations manager who is empowered to deliver government policy, which is Vision for Change, and allocated the budget to do so. While I am delighted to applaud the closure of our mental hospitals, I must condemn the failure of the HSE to ensure the implementation of so many recommendations of Vision for Change, which were meant to provide the foundations upon which the new service was to be based and delivered. I am extremely disappointed and very angry when I think of the numbers of people with serious mental illness incarcerated in our prisons. Vision for Change recommended the building of intensive care rehabilitation units, or ICRUs, across the country to cater for those persons with enduring mental illness. 10 years later, none of them have been provided. Instead, of services which were in existence to cater for those persons who posed a risk to themselves and society were closed down. And bit by bit, the prison population of seriously mentally ill people has increased from 3% in 2006 to over 8% in 2017. I want you to consider the following imaginary situation. A patient suffering from serious psychosis is treated in an acute unit, and after a period of time he is discharged and moves back to his parents. And some time later he's feeling well, he discontinues his medication, he relapses, and he assaults and kills his parents. He's arrested, prosecuted, imprisoned, where he again receives treatment for his illness. He will now spend many years in the Central Mental Hospital. His parents are dead, his siblings and his community are traumatised, and the stigma around mental illness is re-energised. The HSE managers who have closed down those services and who have failed to put in place the comprehensive structures and services recommended never see the connection between their decisions and those dastardly events which happen every year. And they happen every year. And just wait for this year's, because it's coming. And I hope it's not happening in one of your families. Sure, some of those things might have happened anyway, but many would have been prevented. A former Minister for Health stated that Ireland was closer to Boston than to Berlin, and how right she was. There's a book published last week and reviewed in the New York Times published recently and reviewed in the New York Times last week. And it describes the American experience following, and I quote, the deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s, which led to the transfer of patients from large, crowded psychiatric hospitals to what was viewed as more effective community settings. And that book, called Nobody Cares About the Crazy People, The Chaos and Heartbreak of Mental Health in America, written by Ron Powers, describes how the best of intentions can have disastrous consequences as those suffering from mental illness shuffle between crisis institutions, homelessness, and incarceration, and goes on to describe how the jails and prisons are now the largest mental health care providers in the USA. I ask you, are we any different? I suggest not. The prison crisis here requires urgent action, lest this country be prosecuted by the European Committee on Torture because of our neglect of the seriously mentally ill. I'll just tell you a bit about Ron Powers. Ron Powers is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. His wife is a university professor. And their two sons suffered from schizophrenia. One of his sons, he died by suicide. The second boy has recovered to a large extent and is doing quite well. But Mr. Powers has first-hand experience of the mental health service in America. I think you will agree he could have been writing about this country. In his book, Hearing Voices, The History of Psychiatry in Ireland, Professor Brendan Kelly talks about a number of matters which require future consideration and review, and including, and I quote, whether the reduction in inpatient numbers has finally gone too far. Well, having regard to the numbers of seriously mentally ill in the prisons, the answer to that question is an unequivocal yes. In relation to acute beds, I would postulate that if the community services are not significantly enhanced, then the number of acute beds will indeed have to be increased substantially. And it is regrettable that we now have acute units in psychiatry with beds on corridors and the doubling up of beds in rooms, because we have a shortage and there's pressure for admissions for people in crisis. However, with this board, I am absolutely of the view that enhanced 24/7 community services can obviate the need for additional beds. Professor Nolan also spoke about reviewing the relationship between addictions and mental health. And I agree, it is accepted that there's a significant level of comorbidity between addictions and mental illness. Various pieces of literature describe the comorbidity as somewhere between 40 and 60%, depending on who you read. I have often viewed with concern the large numbers of counsellors and others treating persons with addictions who have no training whatsoever in psychiatry, which raises obvious questions. How do they know when it is appropriate to refer a person with addictions for a mental health review? How do they discern whether the mental health problems are secondary to the addiction or the other way around? He also raises questions about future service provision for the elderly, for children and adolescents, and for migrants. I would add some other matters to Professor Kelly's list. The first one I'll talk about is community supervision orders. And every year, and we've spoken about this earlier, every year we hear of horrendous attacks by clients of our services on family members or on complete strangers. The reports are usually accompanied by statements that the person had fallen through the system, had discontinued their medication and their engagement with the services. The P&A has been calling for the provision of by the legislators for imposition of supervision orders for those clients and only those clients who represent a risk to society and who have demonstrated non-compliance with prescribed care. There is a reluctance to support this approach, allegedly because it is not deemed to have been very successful in some other jurisdictions. However, I am strongly of the belief that the real concern is that such orders would not be sufficiently resourced, with the staff required to ensure the appropriate level of follow-up. I suspect that is more the reason than anything else. I understand this concern. However, I ask you, are we saying that rather than do something to try and ensure compliance, that we will accept future assaults, injuries and deaths as collateral damage, an acceptable price for so-called community care? I have listened when a senior politician, a former minister, talked of how the son he loved nearly killed him because of his illness. I have listened when neighbours have spoken about the lovely old couple who've been killed by their psychotic son. I have listened as a mother cried for her child killed by her sick husband. I know, colleagues, that you've listened. Who else is listening? I would also ask for consideration going forward about the full involvement of family in patients' discharge plan. It's covered, I know, today in the Irish Times with the lady from Cork whose kids were killed by her husband. But community care is generally family care, supported by the few mental health professionals assigned to each team. Psychiatrists today, and I feel really sorry for psychiatrists, strange, they're so well paid, but terrible job. Psychiatrists today are faced on a regular basis with the challenge of deciding who amongst the not yet recovered patients can be discharged so that a bed can be freed up for an emergency admission. The decision will be made to discharge the person with the best chance of maintaining their improvement at home with the support of the family, with the support of parents or partners. Yet the patient may deny the psychiatrist the right to share information on his condition with those now required to care for and support him. The psychiatrist cannot act contrary to the instructions of the patient. In my view, the situation is reckless and irresponsible, and government should move to give rights to parents and partners who are so willing to care for their sick family members, so that in doing so, they are fully aware of all the risks associated with their loved one's condition and the precautions that they need or may wish to take to ensure their own safety and that of others. The mental health services need the support of families. The families are equally entitled to meaningful support, including education and training regarding their family members' condition and any risk associated with that condition. Move on then to a little hobby horse. I'd like to see in future improved public understanding of what serious mental illness looks like. One of the most pleasing developments in society has been the manner in which sports people, media personalities, princes, and other social leaders speak openly about their personal experience of mental ill health. Unfortunately, there is sometimes a negative aspect in that their experience may be something which mental health professionals would understand as perhaps mild when compared to the serious mental illnesses we deal with. Now, I would not in any way want to detract from any individual's personal experience of low mood or anxiety, which of course are distressing to the sufferer. However, there's a great danger that society in general, and worse, politicians and health service managers, may dismiss mental health as something not quite as challenging as it actually is, or dismiss mental illness as not quite as challenging as it actually is. On the 8th of January 2017, the Sunday Independent published a letter from a reader who argued, inter alia, that self-help is a cure for depression. And I quote, "We can control our own moods and depression as he did himself." Great flying man. And the following week, a number of readers responded, clarifying from their own personal experience that this man's understanding and reasoning was completely wrong and baseless. Their responses were very welcome. However, the writer who initiated the debate clearly believed that what he had experienced in low mood was clinical depression. Such assumptions are unfortunately common. The media does society a great favour every time it accurately portrays those symptoms of serious mental illness as they afflict our patients. Hopefully, as our society matures and acquires greater learning, the understanding of the true suffering and perhaps even desperation of our patients can be better understood, and the glib presentation of mental illness as susceptible to self-help can be dispelled. I would also like to, on a personal level, because I'm sure there's some might agree with me, I'd like to see the right to access ECT protected. Much of our society seems to associate ECT with that portrayed in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Of course, you and I know it in its sterile clinical form. I know ECT works. I've seen it work. I've worked with patients for whom it works. But it's a very small number of people, very, very small, for whom medication has proven unsuccessful. But there are those who would say it should be banned. So the medication doesn't work, so we don't give them ECT. Doesn't make sense. I'm strongly of the view that until an alternative treatment is found, we must retain the option of ECT for that very small number of people who will benefit from its application. One of the big challenges in delivering the promise of a fully comprehensive mental health service as promised in Vision for Change is the shortage of nurses. This has been discussed at length over the last 2 days. And we need a dedicated and enhanced mental health budget. We know, you've spoken about from the rostrum here, CAMHS requires more nurses. Enhanced community services will require more nurses. The new Forensic Mental Hospital in Portrane will require additional nurses. The development of intensive care rehabilitation units will require more nurses. Existing services need more nurses. The specialist areas of psychiatry, of intellectual disability, pre-, and post-natal mental health services, eating disorders and other specialist services need more nurses. And remember, last year when we were facing into huge problems in crisis after crisis after crisis around the country in relation to the shortage of nurses, We had to force the HSE and the Department of Health to embrace the challenge of training more nurses. And I can pause for a moment and say that we sat there at a meeting with senior managers. And we said to them, this is not a surprise to you. You know the shortage. You have known this shortage better than anyone because you have the figures on a weekly basis. So what were you planning to do? What was the plan? And one of the senior managers just shrugged because there was no plan, except someone probably thought at the end of the day, so we'll bring in a whole pile of untrained people, or we'll bring in a whole pile of minimally trained people, and that'll do the mentally ill. Before our action, they sat and observed our nursing numbers plummet with little sign of any plan to address the shortage. We forced them to establish more training places, and I want to acknowledge the support we got from Siobhan O'Halloran, Dr. Siobhan O'Halloran, and the department at that point. We forced them to address some of the disincentives in the system, which discouraged nurses from joining and staying in our services. Only some. And colleagues, if the upcoming pay negotiations do not deliver on an appropriate graduate salaries for our nurses, we may have to join with our colleagues in the INMO in forcing them to do so. And let me say, the planning has started because we are not going to be rolled over on this one. We have pointed out to the Public Service Pay Commission that when compared with the UK, the principles underpinning pay determination in the Irish Health Service do not alone make no sense, but insults our nursing graduates and indeed all nurses. As shown to you yesterday by Peter in his presentation, in the UK and up the road in Belfast, the nurse on graduating starts on a point higher than the max of the healthcare system and equal to the entry point of the so-called therapy grades. In Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, great bastion of whatever, the new graduate must get to year 5, so before exceeding the max of the HCA, and the same period to reach the first point of the scale applying to the therapy grades. These anomalies just have to be removed. Nurses must be respected. We can no longer have a situation where the nurse is responsible for the practice of a HCA, who is in turn being paid more than the nurse who's supervising her in years 1, 2, 3, 4. Nor is it tenable that the nursing honours degree is accorded a lower pay rating than that of the therapy grades. Society demands that our graduates attain a high level of education, a level that is accompanied by an ability to assess and evaluate. Well, by God, our nurses have those skills. And they have assessed and they have evaluated. And they have decided that they are being encouraged to seek out services where their qualifications are valued and their work rewarded. There is no health service without nurses, and there will never be enough nurses until government address the pay deficit and anomalies. In this morning's Irish Times, the economist John Fitzgerald recommended that future public pay increases in the public sector should track pay increases in the private sector. But he added a very important caveat. He said, exceptions may be justified where the public sector is unable to hire or hold its workers. Minister Leo Varadkar and Minister Harris have acknowledged something has to be done to address the shortage of nurses and indeed some other professions. I think we fear more from ICTU than we fear from government, because ICTU wants all public servants to be treated equally. We'll all move together. Well, it's time that ICTU demonstrated some commitment to the health services and in doing so to Irish society. Otherwise, this crisis will get worse. When I became General Secretary of the P&A, I was told that nursing could never break out of our banding with the clerical in grade 4. We did. Let no one tell you that you are not entitled to a salary scale at the level of the 3rd grades. You are. And I have no doubt that under the leadership of Peter Hughes and his team, nursing will achieve the status it deserves. And the status we need if we are to recruit and retain the numbers needed to respond to the needs of Irish society into the future. Colleagues, I'll come to the conclusion. The P&A has become a strong organisation because we do what is right. We call things honestly. We serve the members. We do not and have never sought to use the union to build a power base to gain influence in favour of ourselves and friends, unlike some others. The P&A stands for what is right, for what is fair and what is best for patient care. I know, colleagues, in looking down at you this evening, that you are living our P&A values. I know, colleagues, that in your hands the P&A is safe. Thank you. Colleagues, thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Someone said this morning that by the time the day was finished, I'd have to expand the doors to get my head through. You know? I want to say a few thanks, and I started to type my thank you note to the various guests who are here, and there's so many. And I realised that if I started going down through each and every guest, we'd be here till this evening at 7 o'clock or something. So can I just say to everyone who's here from a variety of organisations, the INMO, RCSI, the Department of Health and Children, HSE, NMBI, Workplace Relations, Mental Health Ireland, and I've left someone out, I apologise. But thank you all for coming and for sharing this evening with our organisation and with my family. I've enjoyed the battles, and some of you will remember some of them quite bruising. I'm not going to apologise for that. In my very young days, I had a hell of a row with a program manager, and he made some sort of a personal remark, and when the meeting was over, a fellow called John Cooney, who I got to know very well afterwards, I went up to him afterwards to object to his attitude. And he said, "Des, look, it's tough business. If you can't bear the heat, get out of the kitchen." Well, I've certainly taken that on board. And I've tried to make the kitchen as hot as possible over the years. I'm very fond of Bernard Carey, as you know, because Bernard is our kind of man. Strong guy, never stab you in the back. No fun doing that, straight out in front. I must explain the difference later on, but I couldn't do it here. I do want to just say to all the guests, thank you so much for your friendship, for the way you've worked with our organisation. Sometimes we become very frustrated at the slow rate of pace, as we are right now in relation to our mental health services and ID services. But today is a day for celebration, and we look forward to a nice evening this evening. I want to talk for a moment about my colleagues, and we've had a cracking office. It's been a fantastic place to work over the years. I mean, it really is a place with a wonderful atmosphere, and I want to thank Elaine and Paula. Elaine is the office manager, and Paula is her assistant. I'm going to miss the sexual harassment. I've explained to all our staff over the years that there's one rule: if there's anyone going to be sexually harassed, it's me. And since Seamus Murphy left, it's all gone downhill. But I just want to say, though, to everyone, I think people know this anyway, we have a great staff. Elaine is just fantastic. Paul is the same, and the personalities because the first point of contact for our members when they lift the phone, sometimes they're angry or they're upset or things not go well for them and there's pressures at home, whatever it is, the first point of contact is Paula or Elaine, and they do a smashing job, a great job. So thank you very much. Peter has a great team. We've worked very hard over recent years in preparing for the departure of both Seamus and myself, and we have the A team now. Peter at the head, Michael Hayes, who's an excellent and really, really developing so rapidly into one of the finest officials. Caroline Briley. If Caroline knew how good she was, we wouldn't keep her. Excellent. Young Rory. When people discovered it was a Rory Kavanagh, I got a call from one person in Cork and said, "Fair dues to you, Kavanagh, you're taking care of the family before you leave." But just for the record, Rory's from Monaghan, and unfortunately, I'd be proud to have him as another son. He's a real good guy. Aisling is the expert. When we need, I remember in the early days, research was done in the bathroom late at night when it's trying to. My research. Because we didn't have the resources in those days, and we were trying to read stuff late at night or at breakfast in the morning to try and get a handle on some issue. Nowadays, we just say to Aisling X or Y, can you get us a handle on that? And within a couple of days or sometimes a couple of hours, there's a file on the desk. And she does a great job. And I'm delighted to see that having been president of Horatio for around 8 years, that Aisling has now gone in and taken over as a Secretary General. And that's a real challenge. It's a lovely role, lovely involvement with Europeans. And I want to tell you, they don't cut the mustard. I haven't met any of the Europeans who have an attitude or a capability of working harder than us. And the Dutch will say about the Swedes, they can't, because we had a treasure from Sweden, and I would contact him in frustration. He said, Des, you have to understand the Swedes don't multitask. Single track, I don't know. So we should be proud. We are great Europeans, but we're top of the rank. I want to acknowledge that we have a chairman today who's retiring, Fintan Leahy, after 4 years. And well done, Fintan. And of course, he's been replaced by Tracy Quigley, who we've said time and again, but we can't say it often enough, the first woman chair of the P&A. I was on the officer board when we always had a token woman. That's what she called herself. Mary Gantley says, I'm only here because they want one woman. And, you know, that was like, it was 50-50 in those days in terms of male and female, but on the officer board it was all men apart from one. And it has changed hugely now. And we have, in our organisation, in terms of membership, we probably have 85% female now. And we have a significant coterie of very highly qualified, highly talented, and very committed officers, male and female. And sometimes we males feel a bit under pressure. All right, lads. We'll be looking for a quota system shortly. So well done to Tracy. But in relation to the board, you know, it's really important that we have a board where we can have our rows, and by God, we've had rows. Myself and Doug Gibbon got a hammer and tongs, and half an hour later we're having a cup of tea together. And that's important. It's really important that we're able to have those rows, because it means that the officials then, when they go outside the door, are prepared for meeting those awful managers. Because we have those debates, we have those arguments, and we give it and we take it. And it gets hot. That's how it should be. That's how it should be. And Tracy will rule with an iron fist. To the many people who have come today from around the country, people I haven't seen in a long time, people I worked with when they were branch officers, or people I did some work with. And, you know, earlier I was looking at the presentation done by Aisling and Peter. The most important cases we ever do are for the individual who's in trouble. The woman who rang me on a Sunday and I'm behind the goalposts with a flag in my hand at a rugby match underage, and I'm like this, and the poor woman had been put off duty because she had previously, I suppose you'd call it, chastised or disciplined a care assistant who was leaving, and the care assistant, before she got on the plane for Australia, put in a complaint accusing this poor woman of something that was totally untrue. She was put off duty. A letter was sent out to the wrong address in her house, in her estate in West Dublin. So she was humiliated in front of her neighbours. And I met her that Sunday night. This was before the letter arrived. I met her in the Ambassador Hotel with her husband and her daughter, all crying, all upset that Mammy, after 20-something years of excellent nursing, could be accused like this. And over the coming couple of weeks, we sorted it out. But it impacts on those people as individuals. Every one of the people that I've worked with who were accused, and at the end of the day, they're cleared. They are so badly traumatised and they're so badly hurt. And I see more and more accusations coming up nowadays than ever came up before. And 99 out of 100, there's nothing to it. But I've enjoyed representing those individuals, representing the person who's hurt, the person who's accused, and the person who's entitled to our best efforts on every occasion that it happens. Finally, I want to thank my family. Adam has certainly taken a lot of the guilt out of my head because for many years I wasn't at home at night. I was travelling the country. I did make sure the weekends I was there for the matches I were in. But I know I spent an awful lot of time travelling the country, trying to build the branches around the country, working with new branch officers, working with the officer board of the day. And it was very satisfying, but it was also tough because Mary had to manage the home base on her own most of the time. But the guilt I felt, not a lot, but some guilt I felt is assuaged now, Adam, thanks. So the kids are here today, and we'll have a nice evening. Not kids anymore, young men and women. And see my sister and her husband here as well. Some of my neighbours and friends from Carlow, she does Murphy and Eileen. So we'll have a nice evening in your company, and we look forward to that. I want to especially thank Mary. My, I suppose, best friend, lover, wife, my boss, my greatest critic, if I need it, someone capable of giving great guidance, and someone who has an acute sense of judgment in situations and often gets things really acutely right, which is very helpful when I mightn't see the wood from the trees. I'm looking forward immensely now to retiring, even though I'll be busy with a lot of other things. But I tell you a story that over the years, when I sit in the car in the mornings, I always say a prayer, and one of the prayers I have is a prayer for contentment. And I won't tell you the full prayer, but to be content is hugely important. I'm content going into retirement to know that this organisation is on a sound footing, financially sound. We own our lovely new offices. We have a magnificent staff. We have a great board, a great executive. I walked in yesterday morning and I saw all the young people here, mostly young women, and I said to someone, it's like being in a creche. Because and I spoke to a girl last night and I thought she was about 22, and it turned out she was about 32. But anyway, when you're my age, all you young people look really young, and it's great in the organisation. And I remember Michael Kelly, a former assistant secretary, I think it was, in the Department of Health, coming to one of our conferences one year and saying, I'm amazed. He says, I'm amazed. A fellow called Jim Regan had spoken on some issue, and Jim was very articulate, and he said, your members are very young, he says, and they're very articulate. I don't know what I expected, But later on he said he'd been to a few union conferences at the time, and the age profile was a lot higher than what we would have. And last night when I was watching you dancing, guys, I just said, I wish I'd Werner Carey on one side and Seamus on the other, and we'd really enjoy this, And especially when that lovely woman from Nazareth started jiving. I can't jive for Adam, but I love to watch it. It's really good, I want to thank Tony Gregg for his kind words. I should have said it earlier. Nazareth are a great fit for us. They're frontline people, very highly skilled. And when I had my little heart problem a few years ago, and they got me into the ambulance, and the paramedic said, now, Des, I'm going to give you a guarantee. You're not dying on my watch. We'll get you to the hospital and you're fine. You will be alive going to hospital. You don't worry. Very reassuring when you have these two pinprick pains from your chest. But to Tony Gregg, Mick Dixon, all the team, look at smashing group in Nazareth. I've grown to love you all. So in conclusion, Mary, I'm coming home. enjoy the night. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. I just realised when I looked at the far end here, there's one group I really meant to say a welcome to. Is my former branch officers in Carlow, John O'Neill and Brendan Lennon. And to Willie Hackett, who's, I think, down there. Willie Hackett was one of the Magnificent Seven. And they were the 7 people who formed the branch in Carlow in 1980. And the first thing they did was announce a strike. And I joined the service there on the 20th of April, and it was on strike about 10 days later, but that was national. But the lads, Willie was a founder member of the PNA in Carlow, one of Magnificent Seven, and the last couple of years he has got involved with Graham Hines and the lads in rejuvenating the branch, and last night there were 17 here from the branch for the party last night. So to all my Carlow friends, branch officers, Alice, Zelma, oh Brenda's there, yeah. You're all very welcome, and that's it, no more.